Willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video, or welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 11 of my battle series of videos, which will cover the Battle of Marsyas, which was a battle fought between the Persians and the Cadians in 496 or perhaps 497 BC. This video is mainly focused on looking at the battle from a figure gaming point of view, which includes the order of battles, troop types and flow of the battle. If you wish a big picture of why the battle was fought, then this may not be the video for you. But if you want to know about the troop types, force mixes and what actually occurred on the battlefield, or possibly could have occurred on the battlefield, then continue to view on. This is the second video of a battle which I've created, which has almost no information. I only have a few words by Herodotus and the rest is assumptions. As with the first video, you better prepare your salt. The first point I need to define is who exactly are the Carians? Specifically, what army list from DBMM should I use in order to reconcile this battle? Carians were described by Herodotus as being of Minoan descent, while he does report that the Carians themselves maintained that they were Anatolian mainlanders, intensely engaged in seafaring and were akin to the Mysians and the Lydians. The Carians refer to the shrine of Zeus at Mylassa, which, it shared with the Mysians and Lydians, proving that they were brother races. I'm uncertain if I should class the Carians as Ionian Greeks or not, and will assume instead that they're similar to the Lydians, at least in terms of their troop types available under DBMM. It's possible their troops were closer to the Greeks in structure and organisation, but the Lydians do have hoplites, so it probably does make a little sense. Anyway, it's the only way I can reconcile my other source, or my other not very good source, which is the Command and Colour army list or force mix. Let's now cover the order of battle and troop types of the Carian army. We have few clues about the size of the army. The Carians are supposed to have lost 10,000 men, and those which escaped were large enough to join up with reinforcements to fight another battle. It seems the army ranged from probably between 15,000 to 20,000 men, probably the higher level. This is about the only clue that I possess concerning the size of the armies. As with my other battles where I possess almost no information, the only scenario from a game that I could find was from a Command and Colour, as shown here. This is about the only force mix source I possess, and I'll attempt to convert this into a more accurate force mix. One point about the date, most quote 497 BC, however it's likely the actual year of this battle was probably 496 BC. Now, going with our assumption that the Carian army consisted of 20,000 men, then each counter in Command and Colour probably represents about 2,000 men. This gives us 22,000, which is perfectly acceptable. If we assume the Lydian troop types are used, we can convert this into a force mix reasonably simply. This is my final possible force mix. I've used the Command and Colour as the basic template and modified this based on the DBMM Lydian army list. The only unusual point is the lack of cavalry. I find that rather odd. Now, a quick note, in my previous conversions of the Command and Colour force mix, I tried to match it up as closely as possible. I've come to the conclusion that the Command and Colour units are so generic as to only give me a very vague idea of what the actual troop types were. So I've endeavoured to do a lot more conversion in this particular army list than, let's say, the last battle I covered, part 11. Let's go into the DBMM version 2.1 Lydian army list in more detail to determine how I came up with my final force mix. I really do find it strange that there is no cavalry, but it's possible, considering what finally happened at the end of this particular campaign season, even if it was unlikely. According to Command and Colour, the Carians fielded about 6,000 auxiliary troop, which may very well be this troop type called warriors in the DBMM army list. I also assume at least 6,000 of the war bands are this troop type as well, which we'll cover in the later part of the army list. The Carians field around about 3 units of medium infantry, which would be almost certainly the hoplites, as we can see here, which means that the Carians would possess about 6,000 hoplites. Now, according to the DBMM army list, they're actually a surprisingly good quality hoplite. Now, the command and colour talk about a troop type called warbands or barbarian infantry, and there's about 4 units, which means 8,000 men. Now, there's no direct correlation here with this particular army list. However, part of these troops could actually be this troop type, hillmen. However, according to DBMM, the numbers are certainly not that large. So what I'm assuming is that we have 2,000 hillmen, and the remaining warband troops, according to command and colour, are actually the warrior class of troop. In the area of light infantry, the command and colour says that the Carians possess about 3 units, which means 6,000 light infantry. I would assume that possibly as much as half would be archers. The rest of the light infantry would be what DBMM calls peasants, most likely armed with javelins. Now it's time to cover the Persian army, and we have even less information about this force mix than we had about the Carians. Now, we know that they inflicted a major defeat against the Carians, so I would have to assume their numbers were in excess of 20,000. The battle was hard fought, so it could not have been much more than 20,000, although as the Persians were probably unable to outflank the Carians and their troop types are generally lesser, their numbers could be as great as 30,000. That's what I'm going to be going with. If we go back to command and colour and assume each counter represents 2,000 men, the Persian army would consist of 30,000 men, which does seem a little bit high, but probably is quite reasonable. As the Persians did win the battle, they must have outnumbered the Carians. It was a hard-fought battle, so I would originally suspect their army was closer to the 24,000 to 26,000 men, but the Persians were not able to use their outflanking tactic, or probably did not use their outflanking tactic, so they may have needed 30,000 men to defeat the Carians, who were basically heavier armed than the Persians. Now, while the number of 30,000 men seems reasonable and may be correct, the troop composition needs to be dramatically adjusted. The Persians' main infantry consisted of medium troops in the front with bowmen in the rear. Most men would be bow-armed, and the medium and auxiliary combined consisted of this troop type. The lack of cavalry is puzzling, but I'll not change that. The numbers of light infantry are rather high. Let's drill down to more detail to see how I've actually adjusted the command and colour army list into something that DBMM version 2.1 would understand, and which probably is more accurate. This shows my finally converted force mix, once again using command and colour as start point and modifying using a DBM 2.1 army list. Again, my only real point is the lack of cavalry. I just find it really odd that the Persians have only 2,000 cavalry with an army of 30,000 men. On the other hand, you never know, maybe this was the case at this particular point in time. Let's now drill down into more detail into the DBMM version 2.1 army list for the early Archimedean Persians to determine how I've done my troop type conversion. The Persians probably had 2,000 medium cavalry, which are probably standard Persian medium cavalry, Persians, mediums, or Bactrian or similar. The overwhelming bulk of the troops in the Persian army were standard Persian infantry, as seen here. That would include the light foot as well as medium. Now, the Persian infantry, by Greek standards, would be considered as light, so you could probably say that the light infantry were actually this troop type. These probably comprised about a total of 20,000 men, which is by far the biggest component in the army. It's possible some equivalent allied troops were included in this total, but without some additional evidence, I will stay with the simplest solution, and that is that 20,000 men represented Spartabaran foot, which means that they were both front rank would be medium infantry or light infantry, and the rear rank would have bows, and everyone would have a bow regardless. Now the Persians are supposed to have fielded 8,000 light troops. Now some of these light troops may have been this auxiliary type, Armenians, Papagonians, etc. Other troops from this supposed total of 8,000 light troops would have been skirmish archers. And of course the remainder of this 8,000 light infantry probably were, what you see here is javelin of one description or another. When the Carians revolted, the largest Persian army, which was operating in the Hellespont up north, went down south to deal with it. I have to assume the Carians had advanced as far as the Marsyas when they met the Persian army. I have no real idea where the actual battle was fought, but the river Marsyas was on the line of advance of the Persians, sort of. Most sources seem to show the battle being fought around the yellow box at the bottom of the screen here, but I suspect the actual location was in the red box up the top, because this probably was where the main road existed, as you can see with the highway symbol there. This is the battlefield according to command and colour. This could be actually surprisingly accurate. The river behind the Persians and a river on the Persian flank seems reasonable. I suspect the flank river was on the other flank, but this version could also be correct. The opposing flank should contain some broken terrain, but that could be represented by the map edge. The remainder of the playing area is flat and consists of cultivated ground in the most part. This is my guess where the battle was fought, and I have to admit there is a lot wrong, or potentially wrong, with this guess. In this case, the Carian position is bounded by mountains to the left and a river to the right. In front of them is another river, which may be the Marsyas River. Most maps have this battle occurring south of this position, but I can't find any location which kind of makes sense, unless the river was on a flank rather than the rear of the Persian position, which really does not make sense or aligns with any of the minimal accounts that we possess of this battle. Assuming this was the correct position, the Carians were debating if they should defend with the river to their rear, as this shows, or in the other position which you saw earlier. They, in the end, decided against this particular strategy. Now, the Carians clearly had some time to prepare because they were debating which side of the river they should defend upon. So they knew the Persians were coming and they were basically selecting the best possible battlefield to meet them. In the end, the Carians decided to adopt this position, which would force the Persians to cross the river, and thus the river would be to the rear of the Persians. I suppose the strategy was that if the Carians managed to win, that they would pretty badly destroy the Persian army, and they could actually get away. It's debatable whether or not this was the best strategy or not, but regardless, I suspect if the Carians lost the battle and they were on the other side of the river, their already high casualties would even be higher. Now, the command and colour playing area has a river on the Carian left flank. While possible, I suspect it was the opposing flank as shown here. On the other hand, the way rivers' flows do change, and this is well over 2,000 years ago, so who knows where the river flowed back then. The Persians basically approached the Carians, moved up to the river, and clearly decided to cross it. I'm unsure why the Carians did not decide to contest the crossing. Perhaps they thought the Persians would outflank them if they did this. Now, because the Persian left had a river there, and the right had some form of rough ground, the Persians could not attempt to outflank the Carians. This could be why the fight was as difficult as the accounts indicate, even though the Persians outnumbered the Carians. The fight continued for a long period and was very difficult, but finally the Persians managed to win, causing significant losses among the Carians, up to half their army, we think. Now, the Persians did actually lose a reasonable amount of men, I think about 2,000, so that's quite significant considering you're the victor. So that kind of implies this was a difficult battle. Now, this makes me think also that the Persians may have actually attempted to outflank the Carians regardless of the river. Now, this would have taken a long time in order to do so. So the battle would have been tough or difficult until the outflanking force arrived. When it arrived, it hit the Carians in the rear on one flank, and that could cause, or one reason why the Carians had such high casualties. On the other hand, the high casualties could have resulted in the pursuit. Remembering the Persians did have a lot of light troops, which you would assume could move faster than many of the medium to heavy troops that the Carians would have possessed. And so we come to an end of another of my wild guesses. Now, look, for those interested in why I'm doing these battle reports with such minimal information, is that I'm attempting to create a number of scenarios for a Greek-Persian wars for my DBMM troop type based set of rules, which in turn is based on a SPI board game. So while the battles may actually represent more fiction than fact, I'm hoping that they'll still give players a good solid game. For those interested, this shows the force mix that I'm initially attempting in my playtests using DBMM troop types and DBMM army lists. While this does use DBMM points values, there is a slight modification for certain types of leaders, as I'm using this for the pre-17th century wargaming rules, which require this. But this only changes the point values of the leaders by a few points either way. So you could still use this for a pure DBMM game. What you see here is a 177 point Persian army against a 125 point Carian army. And so we come to the end of part 12 of my military history videos covering yet another battle of the Greek-Persian Wars. I'm not certain if it's something specific to the period, but the battles I've been covering so far all seem rather similar to each other. This battle is a bit more unusual due to the lack of cavalry, and thus could be a bit more interesting, but even in this battle the Persians may have attempted an outflanking move with their limited number of cavalry, thus it would be similar to most of the others that I've been covering. It's almost as if the Persians have a basic strategy which they just keep on repeating every time they meet an enemy army. In some ways this is similar to the Carthaginian tactic which they used at the beginning of the Second Punic War, which is, the strong flanks, weak centre strategy. Anyway, it's interesting to note because this seems to imply that most armies were one-trick ponies until, of course, the tactic failed and then they struggled to find a new tactic. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.